Hey everyone, I'm Ephraim Matos. Welcome back to another episode of the Overwatch. So, the first story I want to get into today is about China doing these military drills, specifically with fighter jets alongside the Egyptian military. So, according to the South China Morning Post, Chinese fighter jets have conducted combat training with their Egyptian counterparts in a joint exercise following a major Chinese Air Force deployment to the Middle East. The drill, which was launched on Saturday and is expected to continue into early next month, which is September, is part of the second China-Egypt Eagles of Civilization Joint Air Force training exercises. And then the article goes on to list the different types of aircraft that China is bringing in. You got fighter jets and aerial refueling tankers, and you've got different early warning and command and control aircraft and some different helicopters as well. Now, here's kind of the important part that the article mentions. So these Chinese aircraft flew more than 6,000 kilometers, so that's 3,700 miles, over 9 hours to reach Egypt, crossing 4 countries, according to a report by state broadcaster CCTV. So that's a Chinese broadcaster. And then the Chinese state TV also said, through cross-border deployment and rapid loading and unloading operations, the exercise tested the Air Force's capabilities in long-range force projection, rapid deployment, and integrated operations. So basically what's going on right now is China is practicing moving large amounts of aircraft and an entire sort of battle group of aircraft, so fighter jets and transports and helicopters, and projecting that power all the way to Africa. And in the particular case of the J-16s, these are like advanced fighter jets that China is building, this is the first time that those jets have ever been in Africa. Okay, so then the natural question is, why is China doing this? Well, again, remember, China is trying to become a global force, right? They are trying to expand their empire. They are trying to expand their influence all around the world. And in Africa in particular, China has a lot of different interests, everything from rare earth minerals to these different port projects to different infrastructure projects and pipelines and railways. And China's building a lot of different things in Africa. And China isn't just trying to protect their investments, like their actual infrastructure. What they want to be able to do is, in the future, they want to be able to keep certain governments in power in Africa in the long run. Because if those governments fall, well, then China loses their allies. And so right now, China is thinking very long term. They're thinking about, okay, how can we project force onto the continent of Africa and around the Middle East, similar to how the United States currently does. Now, this particular exercise where China is deploying these fighter jets to Egypt, well, they're saying that the primary thing that they're doing is they're learning how to work with the French-built Rafale jets, which are the type of jets that Egypt flies. And the general idea is that both the Egyptians and the Chinese, as they take their fighter jets up and they do different maneuvers and they sort of fight each other, in these mock simulated battles, that both the Egyptians and the Chinese will learn how to, maneuver their aircraft and will learn about how to fight the other type of aircraft. And so what China is getting to do, China is getting the opportunity to actually fly against, like they're able to fly their aircraft against NATO-built aircraft. China is letting their pilots get experience actually going up against technology that's built by NATO countries. And they're able to sort of test and see how their technology stands up against ours. But the reality is there's something much deeper actually going on here. The reality is that Egypt has a ton of US-built aircraft and missile defense systems. So just as a short list, right now, Egypt has 220 F-16s. Those are American-built fighter jets. They have 46 Apache gunship attack helicopters. Egypt also has 7 of the E-2 Hawkeyes. These are basically command and control signals type aircraft. Egypt also has 1,100 American tanks. But the thing that we need to really pay attention to here is that the Egyptians have these medium-range air defense systems. They also have Avenger and Stinger short-range missile systems. And so basically, China will have the opportunity to take their new fighter jet and test it against these types of American-made systems. And the Egyptians will likely give China that information so China can see how their fighter jets stack up against US-built air defense systems. And if this doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal, well, it's this exact kind of information sharing and this exact kind of technical information that allowed Iran to shoot down multiple American aircraft. Iran was able to shoot down a helicopter. Iran was able to shoot down a fighter jet, an F-18. Iran was able to shoot down an A-10 Warthog, I believe, as well. So there's been multiple aircraft from the United States that have been shot down. And I'm sure there have been more US aircraft that were that were damaged during all the bombings and stuff that we're doing in Iran right now that didn't get reported to the public for obvious security reasons. So the more our enemies know about what our aircraft can do and what they can't do, the more our troops are at risk. And so then the obvious next question is, well, why do we allow Egypt to have a bunch of US made aircraft and air defense systems? Why do we allow them to have all this military technology when they aren't even truly like loyal or allied with us? Egypt has also purchased different fighter jets from Russia. So presumably both the Russians and the Chinese are going to get a lot of data about American built military systems from the Egyptians because Egypt has the technology now. So as a country, we need to really think about, okay, if we're going to provide any kind of military support for another country, if we're even going to sell them even our old equipment, we need to make sure that we're only selling to countries that are truly loyal to the same worldview that we have. Because you might have a certain regime, you might have a certain Egyptian government that's in place right now, or in the past rather, that was aligned with the United States interests. And so we say, sure, let's go ahead and let them purchase a bunch of our equipment. But the problem is you don't know who's going to be in power in a place like Egypt in 10 years or 20 years. So you might be trying to help out an ally today, but you don't know that they're going to be your ally in 20 years. And make no mistake, Egypt, of course, is a very anti-Semitic, very radical Islamic country. They have a history of trying to commit genocide against Israel. They're, of course, a hotbed of anti-Western terrorism. And then they have this alliance with China, which, of course, is a communist, tyrannical country who's committed to genocide against the Uyghurs. And they're befriending the Taliban, and they're pumping drugs into the United States, and they want to conquer Taiwan. And so what we're seeing here is just this continued alignment that we're seeing more and more around the world, and even here in the United States, of this alignment between radical Marxism and radical Islam. You see it over and over and over again. And so when we're dealing with Islamic countries or we're dealing with Marxist countries, we have to be very, very careful because in the future, they will align with each other. Now, these ideologies are mutually exclusive of each other, but what they are united by is their hatred for the West, their hatred for the United States in particular. And so in this situation where we see the Chinese government, the Chinese military working directly with the Egyptian military to figure out how to defeat US-built military systems, well, we shouldn't be shocked by this. This kind of thing is going to continue to happen over time. And so we need to be level-headed about it. We need to understand that there are major real ramifications to the different geopolitical decisions that different administrations make. And as American citizens, we need to be aware of that so we can vote in people and hold our leaders accountable to make sure that this kind of thing is more and more difficult to happen in the future. We need to invest into higher and better technology that we do not share with countries that are not aligned with us in the long run. Because our friend today could be our enemy tomorrow, and they could also be making friends with other countries that are already our enemy. All right, so the next story I want to quickly talk about is how the United States just passed $40 trillion in debt. Now, again, this podcast is not about economics. I talk about national security, geopolitics, Western civilization, that kind of thing. And I think that within this debt crisis that we find ourselves in and that we are continuing to build, I think that there's an underlying deeper national security problem that nobody's really paying attention to, which I'll get to that here in just a minute. So according to CBS News, the Treasury Department's daily financial report shows that the nation's debt reached $40 trillion on August 18th, more than double its level in 2017. The federal debt has ballooned because government spending is outstripping revenue, forcing the U.S. to borrow more money to cover the shortfall. So basically, we're spending more money than we're making, and so we're constantly having to borrow money from people and pay back that money at interest, which just, of course, adds to the debt. The article goes on, quote, "We've been running deficits for the last 26 years, and we've basically ignored a lot of the structural challenges that exist in our budget that are very well known," said Michael Peterson, who's the CEO of the nonpartisan Peter G. Peterson Foundation. "It's clearly been accelerating because, like any debt problem, the longer you ignore it, the worse it gets." So there's nothing magical about the $40 trillion number. It's just an absurdly large number is, I guess, why it's being highlighted right now. But the underlying problem that's causing this debt to go up is not being fixed. And the problem is much worse than most people realize. So here's some quick facts from the Government Accountability Office. As of April 2026, so a few months ago, publicly held debt was $31 trillion, which was roughly equal to the size of the country's economy. So basically that means that we owe more money than we're making as a country. This would be like if you made $100,000 a year, but you now have more than $100,000 worth of debt. Obviously, not a great position. The report goes on. Publicly held debt is projected to grow more than twice as fast as the economy over the next 10 years, reaching 123% of the size of the economy in 2036. So basically, as the economy grows and as the country makes more money, we're just getting into deeper and deeper debt faster than we're actually bringing in more money. So again, this is like saying if you make 100,000 this year and next year you get a raise and you're making 105,000, well, that sounds great. But if you bring in an extra $10,000 of debt, well, now you owe $110,000. You're in a worse position than you were before you got your raise. And here's the line I really want to focus on right now. Government spending on net interest in fiscal year 2025 exceeded federal spending on national defense and is projected to keep growing. And then there's a chart here that shows by the year 2056, the US debt is likely to be 250%, so 2.5 times what our GDP is. So again, this is like saying that you make $100,000 a year, but you have $250,000 worth of debt. That's the situation we find ourselves in. Okay, so obviously the financial situation is not good, but quite frankly, it doesn't have to be the end of the world. Okay, so again, using the same analogy, suppose you're bringing in $100,000 a year, but you have a $300,000 mortgage. So your debt is 3 times higher than your income. Well, is that the end of the world? Well, no. And why not? Well, because if you just make your payments, you'll pay off the mortgage eventually and you'll be able to move on. And so if the United States stopped adding to the debt and we just paid off our current debt, there is a path forward to where we would no longer have this problem. But the issue is that the US continues to expand our debt. We continue to take on more debt. So this is like the person who makes $100,000 a year, has a $300,000 mortgage, which in and of itself isn't bad, but then they take out $20,000 a year of extra credit card payments and extra credit card debt and all the interest that comes along with that. Well, now that same person is in a really, really bad position. Eventually, they're going to go bankrupt. They're going to lose their home. They're going to lose everything. Okay, so what's my point with all this? What does this have to do with national security or geopolitics? Well, the reason that we have so much debt, the reason we are spending so much money is because of entitlement programs. We are spending money on things like Social Security and Medicaid and welfare. This is what we are spending so much of our money on as a country. And the reality is that no politician is going to get up and actively go after these programs and shut them down. It's political suicide. On the right, you have people who are, in theory, supposed to be more fiscally responsible, but a lot of the conservative voter base is older population folks who are on Social Security. And on the liberal side, they don't want to cut expenditures either because many of their constituents are on welfare and are on all these government aid programs. And so what do? Well, in my opinion, what I think will likely happen in the near future is that we're going to start scrapping our defense budget. We're going to start pulling money away from law enforcement, national defense. We're going to stop making aircraft carriers, and we're going to stop investing as much into building more advanced fighter jets and things of that nature. And so as the United States starts to spend less on things that matter for national defense and national security and the long-term geopolitical standing of the United States in the world, well, China is going to move in and fill those gaps. Russia is going to move in and fill those gaps. Radical Islamist groups are going to move in and fill those gaps. The less power that the United States projects, for example, in the Pacific Ocean, the more likely China is to make a move on Taiwan, which again, like we talked about last week, protecting Taiwan isn't just about protecting an ally. It's about protecting access to technology that allows us to defend ourselves and run our industries and run our vehicles and run our military technology. And so us here in the United States not taking care of this national debt problem, this is going to have massive ramifications for the entire world at some point in the near future. It could be 10 years, could be 20 years, could be 5 years. But as the US has to spend more money on our debt and on taking care of all of these welfare and entitlement programs here in the United States, that means that we can spend way less on our defense. If we didn't have all these interest payments, we could double our defense budget. If we didn't have all these other entitlement programs, we could triple or quadruple our defense budget. I'm not saying that we necessarily need to do that. I'm just saying it would give us the flexibility to be able to do that. What happens if there's another world war? What happens if there's another major crisis that we have to respond to? The government needs money to be able to deal with those kinds of crises. Right now, our country is being very, very short-sighted in how we protect ourselves and on how we protect our interests and our allies around the world. And our domestic issues, our domestic lack of financial responsibility are going to have global impact. And so we need to be aware of that and take that seriously. So the last story I want to talk about today is this article that the BBC put out this week. And it was about these Ukrainians who are fighting against Ukraine. So these are prisoners of war. These are Ukrainians Ukrainians who fought for Russia against Ukraine and then were captured by Ukraine and are now being held in prison camps. The article is titled "Captured Ukrainian-Born Soldiers Tell BBC Why They Fought for Russia." It's a very interesting read. It takes like 5 minutes, and I highly recommend that everybody goes and reads it. And by the way, if you're not already subscribed to the Overwatch weekly email that I put out, this is a good reason to subscribe. Articles like this are linked in there, and so you can go and read these. So the article starts off with the journalist talking about how they went into this prison to interview prisoners, and it says, "But not all the prisoners are Russian. Amongst them are soldiers from Ukraine itself, the men who went to war with their own country." It says, "We gave everyone the right to refuse an interview and spoke to those who agreed far away from any guards and without cameras." But there's a little section here that I want to focus on, and it's an example of this Ukrainian-born prisoner named Anton. And it says, "Anton was 10 when his part of Ukraine's eastern Donbass region was taken over by forces loyal to Moscow. In 2022, when Vladimir Putin escalated to all-out war, he turned 18 and signed up to fight immediately for Russia. Quote, 'I don't regret my choice. I went to defend my land.' Anton insists and tells me his friends volunteered too." Anton goes on, "Then you get the SMS messages, dead, dead, dead. Other prisoners say the same, that all those they went to war with have been killed. They also say fewer people are volunteering to replace them despite enormous sign-up fees, which suggests Putin's desire to avoid mass mobilization could soon be tested." And again, I recommend you go read the whole article from the BBC directly. It's very interesting and offers a very unique view into what's going on in Russia and in Ukraine with this particular war. Okay, but I want to talk a little bit about why Ukrainian-born people, young men in particular, decide to go and fight for Russia against Ukraine. Because typically when an occupying force comes into a country, the young men naturally want to rebel against this occupying force, and they want to fight against it. We saw this in Iraq. We saw this in Afghanistan. Russia is, of course, seeing this in Ukraine. And so I want to take a moment and kind of think about the mindset of individuals who are deciding, of Ukrainian individuals who are deciding to fight for Russia. Okay, now in order for this to make sense, we need to establish something. And it's something that Americans, we don't really think about when it comes to the Ukraine-Russia war. So as Americans, we typically look at Ukraine is the good guy, Russia's the bad guy, Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia is, trying to take over this country, and that's bad. And to be fair, I agree with that. I agree with that view. However, Russia doesn't see it that way. Russia sees the Ukraine war similar to the way that we would look at the Civil War here in the United States. So during the U.S. Civil War, the South, of course, broke away from the North. And so then the Union Army, called the Union Army because we wanted to maintain the Union, went into the South and fought the Southern Army to make sure that they were not able to secede from the Union, to make sure that the South didn't break off and become its own country. And so during that Civil War, nobody in the United States, nobody in the North, certainly President Abraham Lincoln didn't feel like he was invading a foreign country. He didn't feel like he was going into somebody else's country to conquer them. In his mind, in Abraham Lincoln's mind, he was fighting a war of unification. He was trying to keep his country together because he saw Americans and all of America as being one country, one people that should not be divided. And what we have to understand is that in like a weird, twisted way, Putin thinks the same thing about Ukraine. Putin sees Ukraine as being part of Russian culture, as part of Russia, the country, sort of the broader empire. In Putin's mind, Ukraine cannot be separate. Ukraine must be united with Russia because in his mind, it is Russian. Now, of course, Putin has the little problem that Ukraine speaks Ukrainian, not Russian. Ukrainians have Ukrainian last names, not Russian last names. Ukraine has its own distinct culture and they have their own distinct government. So it's not quite an apples to apples comparison to say that Russia is fighting some sort of civil war of unification to keep the country from falling apart. But you just have to understand that that's kind of what's going on in Putin's mind. Now, the reason I bring this up is because when the Russian military goes into certain regions of Ukraine, particularly the far eastern parts of Ukraine, there are many Ukrainian-born people who see themselves as Russian. So not all Ukrainians totally agree that Ukraine should be its own country. There are many Ukrainians who want to be a part of Russia. And so on a base level, this is why you're going to have some Ukrainians are naturally going to just fight alongside the Russian military. Okay, but there is a deeper thing here, and it has to do with education of kids. So Russia has this program called the Yun Armia program. When Russia goes into a new part of Ukraine and conquers and occupies a new part of Ukraine, what they do is they take a lot of the Ukrainian kids and they put them into this sort of kids re-education program. And it's a very militaristic style program. And we're talking little girls as young as 4 and 5 years old being put into this program. And part of the program is to teach Ukrainian kids that they aren't Ukrainian and instead to teach them that they're Russian. So basically, Russia is indoctrinating these Ukrainian kids into Russian ideology about Ukraine rather than Ukrainian ideology about Ukraine. And this is a big program. So just down in Crimea, there are 58,000 Ukrainian kids that are a part of this Russian Yun Armia program. And so you have 58,000 kids who are Ukrainian born who are learning that they're actually Russians. They're being told that they're Russians. They're speaking Russian. Now, if you remember the article we just read about the man named Anton who joined the Russian military, if you remember, it said that he was 10 years old when the Russians showed up and took control of the area where he lived. And then 8 years later, he decided to join the Russian military. Well, this whole Yun Armia program is one of the ways that Russia gets Ukrainian kids to eventually fight against Ukraine, just like Anton did. Now, to be clear, the article didn't say that Anton was part of the Yun Armia program, but Anton was certainly part of a culture that was teaching him to be Russian and was certainly spreading the idea that Ukraine and the Ukrainian government is run by a bunch of Nazis. And so this is happening on a mass scale in places that Russia currently occupies. And remember, the Ukraine war really started back in 2014. So we have more than a decade of indoctrination of tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian kids. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, first, it's important to understand kind of the mindset of what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. I think it's important to understand that there are differing points of view, like understanding the Russian point of view of the Ukraine war is important to understanding their actions. I don't agree with it, but it's important to understand why these groups justify what they do. It's important to understand why Russia thinks it's okay to invade Ukraine. And it's important to understand how Russia indoctrinates kids to eventually get those Ukrainian kids to fight for Russia. Because those same kinds of techniques can be used here in the United States. Because right now here in the United States, there are many people who are teaching American kids to hate the United States. Just like Russia teaches captured Ukrainian kids that the Ukrainian government is run by Nazis, well, there are a lot of people in America today who say that any kind of conservative government is a bunch of Nazis. And these same people teach their kids that America is bad, that we were founded on slavery, that we're white supremacists and evil capitalists and all this stuff. It's all the same kind of propaganda that the Russians teach to the captured Ukrainian kids. There's massive amounts of similarities there. And so when you teach American kids to hate their own country, just like Russia teaches Ukrainian kids to hate their own country, well, just like the Ukrainian kids grow up and fight against Ukraine, American kids will grow up and fight against America and will happily commit violence or will at least applaud violence against American citizens. We saw this in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination. The people who were cheering and mocking his death are people who have been taught that America is evil and that the ideas that Charlie Kirk stood for are evil. And this is how you get young people to join Black Lives Matter mobs destroying cities. And this is how you get people to join Antifa. These kinds of actions don't just come out of nowhere. They come from years of indoctrination. They come from years of lying to young people and changing the way that they see the world. And now those kids are coming of age and they're in their early 20s, and we're starting to see them vote in radical socialists. Radical socialists who hate the United States, who say openly that their goal is to get rid of the US Constitution. Or they're voting in candidates who are radical Muslims. So as Americans, we need to be aware of this and we need to stand up against it. We have to speak out against it. And if you're a parent, you need to understand the type of images and messaging that your kids are seeing on social media and what they're seeing at school. Because if you don't want your kids to grow up and hate their country and hate you and sympathize with genocidal regimes like the Russians and the Chinese, well, then you have to teach them to think for themselves, to think critically, to allow other people to express their opinions and beliefs without getting violent. Because otherwise, we as a nation will die from within rather than being conquered by some foreign enemy. And that's all for this week. Be sure to go to theoverwatch.co or just click the link in the description if you want to get on the weekly newsletter that I send out. Thanks so much for watching or listening. I'm Ephraim Matos, and this is The Overwatch.